everyone, and welcome to the Equal Opportunity Committee's 24th meeting of 2012. Can I ask everyone to set any electronic devices to either flight mode or switch them off completely? Around the table we are joined with the clerking and research team, official reporters and broadcasting services. We are also supported by security, and can I welcome the observers in the rear of the room. My name is Mary Fee and I'm the convener of the committee, and I'm now going to ask committee members to introduce themselves in turn.
I'm Marco BIAGI, I'm the deputy convener of the committee.
Good morning, I'm Dennis Robertson, MSP for Aberdeenshire West.
Good morning. My name is John Finney, Highlands and Islands member of the committee, and at this point, if I may, convener, declare that the register of interest shows that I'm a member of Amnesty.
Thanks for that, John.
Yeah, I'm Siobhan McMahon, MSP for Central Scotland.
John Mason, MSP for Glasgow Shettleston.
Alec Johnston, MSP for North East Scotland and a substitute member of the committee.
Thank you. Agenda item 1 today is an evidence session on where Gypsy travellers live, with representatives from organisations that have carried out research into Gypsy travellers' accommodation needs. Can I welcome the witnesses that have joined us this morning and ask if the witnesses could introduce themselves in turn, please, starting with Professor Hampton.
Well, I'm Kay Hampton. I'm with the Scottish Human Rights Commission. I'm a commissioner there.
Thank you.
My name is Duncan Wilson. I'm Head of Strategy and Legal at the Scottish Human Rights Commission.
My name is Jim Page. I'm Government Affairs Manager for the Equality and Human Rights Commission in Scotland.
Thank you for that. The committee have a number of questions for the panel, and I'm going to start with Siobhan McMahon and then move on to Dennis Robertson. Siobhan.
Thanks, Marina. We thought it would be helpful as a committee and useful to us to find out if you've visited yourself a Gypsy Traveller site, and if you have, what your impression was of that site, given that we've recently taken visits across Scotland and found for ourselves the difficulties that Gypsy travellers are living with, so we thought it might be helpful to start there. Has anyone visited the site? Okay,
now I haven't visited any of the sites recently, but I have visited an urban settlement in Govan Hill, where the Roma, approximately 3,000 of them, live. And the conditions there are quite dire. Most of them are in privately rented accommodation. And although they pay their taxes and very high rents, they suffer appalling conditions in terms of overcrowdedness and so on. So that's the only one I've recently visited.
I would just add that in the course of undertaking a major research project, a mapping of the state of human rights in Scotland, our research officer, in addition to looking at secondary sources, we also undertook some focus groups and in-depth individual interviews, and that did include Gypsy traveller communities, including visits to their communities. And the evidence that was recorded is included in the report which we published at the end of October, and indicates, as others research have, lack of sanitation, poor living conditions, as I know members of the committee also will have experienced during site visits.
I am here to replace my colleague Chris Oswald, who unfortunately can't be here today following a bereavement. Chris is very much the Commission's policy lead on Gypsy traveller issues and has extensive experience, including site visits. I personally have not visited any Gypsy traveller sites.
Just to follow up on one point, Professor Hampton, you said that the site that you visited had a number of, well, you said Roma travellers, and 3,000 was the number you gave?
3,000 live in that area, around
right.
that area, the west.
Because that's quite a substantial number, and I think for the site that I visited myself, it was quite small in number, so I wonder if you could expand on what you saw there, because you described it as dire, but what would you mean by that?
I didn't go there to study
Sure.
the Roma situation. I went there to do another piece of research, which I should put on the table. It's not part of what the Scottish Human Rights did, but it's part of a piece of research that I did on the Muslim community. And in the course of doing that piece of research, I experienced a number of my respondents in that study talking about the situation that they lived in, and also about the prejudice that they faced in that area. But it's no exaggeration to say that very large families are crammed into accommodation that are actually for approximately, 4 or 5 people. And, they have no other option. But they do have large families, and they do tend to want to live close by. And the only option is to actually live in a tiny little flat.
Okay, thank you.
Dennis?
Thank you, Convener. It would appear that throughout Scotland the story is much the same, but there are parts of Scotland where things seem to be slightly worse than others. A recent study in 2009, it was a collective study by Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire and Moray councils. There was a suggestion that there should be 35 pitches for gypsy travelling of different sizes, some transient sites and some with actually static and obviously a combination thereof. My understanding is that within that community there is one site at Clinkertay, which sort of for Aberdeen and probably Aberdeenshire. What dialogue have you had with the councils with regard to the lack of sites for gypsy travelling people?
Yes, I'll
Yeah,
pass it
yeah,
if you would like
yeah.
to. Thank you.
The Commission is well aware that there are particular problems, seasonal problems affecting Aberdeenshire, and has had dialogue with local authorities in that area, and indeed with a number of elected representatives from this Parliament, as well as discussing it at ministerial level. As Dennis Robertson rightly says, there is a clear mismatch between needs, both in terms of quality and quantity, and what is actually provided. He picks up on a secondary issue that's really very, very important to this. It is encouraging that Moray, Aberdeenshire and Aberdeen City jointly looked at this problem, this issue, because that in itself goes some way towards recognising the geographical and seasonal nature of gypsy travel communities in the northeast of Scotland. Summer movement being more in one place in the winter. We have been encouraged. We were encouraged by Alex Neil's intervention when he was in his previous communities minister's role in the previous Parliament, and the leadership shown by some MSPs in the northeast of Scotland to try and address this issue in a more measured and a holistic manner, looking at the question of not just what individual public authorities were or weren't doing within their geographical areas, but trying to take a more measured and cross-border, cross-jurisdiction approach. But we do recognise that the northeast of Scotland remains a particular flashpoint, and feel that is unlikely to change anytime soon, unless the wider questions around political leadership, media portrayal of gypsy travellers and disputes over land and stopping places and settlements are addressed, and authorities both utilise individually the regulatory tools they have through the statutory equality duties, the Human Rights Act, but also collectively make sure that they are not falling into the trap of silo working by setting outcomes through the community planning process that don't take account of the fact that gypsy traveller communities move across local authority boundaries in a seasonal manner.
Yeah, if I could just add to that. A lot of the work has been done by our partners at the Equality and Human Rights Commission and Amnesty. What we have done is, you probably have copies of the submission we made in July on the back of more current scrutiny of information on gypsy travel communities. And we have a dedicated chapter in our publication, Getting It Right, which focuses on where Gypsy traveller communities live. And you'll find from that there isn't one set or one type of accommodation that suits all. And the pattern and the movement and the lifestyle is such that it's not confined to local authorities. So what we found was, and what I think comes under great criticisms from both international and regional human rights committees, is that there is no consistency across Scotland. And as a nation, we need to have consistency in service provision. So if you go to one local authority, you might find excellent accommodation, as compared to other areas. And in some places, for 21st century Scotland, it's quite shocking to see the lack of sanitation and so on that you would actually expect in a third world country. And we are, gravely concerned about these conditions. We know of the work that's been done since 2001. And in our focus groups, what was disappointing was that a number of the people, the respondents that participated in the focus groups from the Gypsy traveller communities, felt that while some action was taken, it was not taken consistently across. So it was almost like a postcode lottery situation. And being transient, you would expect that they would want to expect the same level of services across the country. And I think it's incumbent upon those who provide accommodation, who are responsible for providing accommodation, to actually address that urgently. Now, I know that you've been hearing a lot of negative issues relating to accommodation, and the Scottish Human Rights Commission would like to introduce an approach to actually address the problem that we have, so that you take into account the rights of settled communities as well as the rights of the Gypsy traveller community. At the Scottish Human Rights Commission, we have developed a model for working for conducting interactions with different parties, bringing the rights, those responsible for providing accommodation, as well as those who are affected by accommodation issues, together in an interaction whereby we will establish the facts, have an assessment, and negotiate outcomes that are suitable for all parties. So that's what we'd like to offer. We have actually not done any direct research. We've done secondary research, and we've spoken to people from these communities. We find that we have a solution that might work, and that's what we would like to offer.
Thank you.
Can I ask, following on from that question, do the panel think that local authorities should be required to provide sites, and there should be a minimum standard to those sites across the country? And also, should a mapping exercise be done to track the movements of Gypsy travellers to provide transit sites? Mr. Page?
On the second point, yes, I think we need to make sure that we recognise that bad policy inevitably is an inevitable consequence of trying to fit people to bureaucratic boundaries and systems rather than vice versa. A regional and indeed a national approach which properly understands the seasonal and geographic movement of Gypsy traveller communities throughout Scotland is an obvious and necessary precondition for better planning and provision. On the point about requirement, yes, we've argued that while there is guidance there for local high housing strategies, there is no requirement, no follow through to actual provision. Getting the provision right is about effective dialogue and communication with the communities affected, and this is where the equality duties can play a really important part in providing a framework for that dialogue. As the committee knows, the general equality duty has three elements: the duty to eliminate discrimination, promote equal opportunities, and foster good relations between different groups. We see the the regular annual flashpoints between traveller communities and settled communities in parts of Scotland as one of the most pressing good relations challenges the country faces. Now, sitting underneath the general duties since spring of this year, all the key devolved public authorities, including all local authorities, are required to meet a set of specific duties that set out the steps they must take to meet the general duty. Included in these are requirements to impact assess, for example. But crucially, there is the requirement to, by April of next year, as you know, set equality outcomes and across all protected groups, and where authorities have decided not to set equality outcomes against a particular group, they must furnish evidence as to why and how they reached that decision. Now, we would be surprised. I should also say that in setting these outcomes, public authorities are required to engage with the communities affected. This seems therefore like a very useful, positive regulatory roadmap for how public authorities could begin to think through needs and future provision. We will be commissioning analysis of the first round of these equality outcomes following the April 2013 deadline. We would be very surprised if, for example, in areas where there is a long historical record of seasonal flashpoints between travelling and settled communities, that this hasn't been identified and addressed through equality outcomes. But we also want to see on top of that that there is read-through from what public authorities are individually setting as equality outcomes for them and what they are setting collectively through the community planning partnership process across local authority areas, but again, more widely, and I can't stress this enough, how they are making sure that this works together so that we don't have disjointed or ineffective plans which are brushing up against local authority boundaries. And the city-shire distinction in Aberdeenshire is perhaps one of the most obvious examples of where that boundary does not actually exist in the heads of the communities that are affected by poor dialogue and planning.
Yes, certainly. I'll just bring Dennis in before I bring you in, Mr. Wilson.
Yeah, just to follow up, you are suggesting that there's such a mismatch of need and provision, and we indicated obviously the 1 in 35 aspect within the North East. And what do you believe are actually the main barriers for actually not proceeding with the provision of the sites, of the need that has been identified for the North East in particular? You've indicated some of that already with your answer, but I'm just wondering, what do you think are the main barriers in proceeding with actually identifying and then providing suitable sites?
We have characterised the 3 challenges facing successful resolution of this issue as being around land legitimacy and leadership. There needs to be identification of suitable and appropriate land for that matches the varying needs of traveller communities. There needs to be a recognition of the legitimacy of the travelling way of life, and of the fact that travellers have been part of the fabric of Scottish culture and society since the Middle Ages. Travelling communities are part of what Scotland is, and that is often neglected and forgotten, particularly in heated local debates, where those who shout loudest, often, unfortunately, not always, but often facilitated by slanted and incomplete media coverage of the issues, sensationalising media coverage of the issues. It is forgotten that there is an absolute legitimate right for travelling communities to have access to appropriate services and land. And the final issue is one of leadership. This is both an issue for the traveller community itself, where there are gaps in capacity and support required to help the development of unified voices, clear agendas and leadership within the community, then we should be looking to help foster that. But crucially, it's a matter of leadership at the national, regional and local political level. It has been intimated to us, as we mentioned in our written submission, that it is quote-unquote political suicide to be seen to be, again, quote-unquote, standing up for travellers. So we end up in this negative spiral of lack of adequate, hugely inadequate provision, leading to sensationalist local media coverage and a failure, without sounding too negative, a failure in some places of political leadership to actually address this problem, and a desire to simply kick the can down the road to next summer when the same problems will be confronting the same people. So it's the interlinked 3 L's of land, leadership and legitimacy that are the barriers and also the solutions to these questions of local site provision. Thank you.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. If I could just build on Ewan's points and come back to your original question about duties. The first thing to note is that there is already an obligation, firstly on the United Kingdom and then on Scottish ministers and through the Human Rights Act, also on public authorities, to, in the words of the European Court of Human Rights, facilitate the gypsy way of life. That's a decision in a case involving the United Kingdom, so it is binding on this country. In the case of Connors against the UK. And the Scottish ministers also, of course, have obligations under the Scotland Act to implement the full range of international obligations that the UK has. And those include the right to adequate housing under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and its equivalents in the Children's Rights Convention and other international human rights law. That right has several elements, some of which are immediate obligations such as ensuring adequate sanitation and security of tenure. Both of these, of course, have been issues for gypsy travellers, continue to be issues today. So basic services. And the final element of that would, of course, be the duty to ensure that no one is evicted without due process and adequate alternative accommodation. An eviction without due process of law and or without adequate alternative accommodation is a gross human rights violation, in the words of the UN Commission on Human Rights as it was at the time. So I think Scotland at least is in a risky situation with regards to whether or not the proportionality of evictions is consistently balanced appropriately. And weighed, of course, alongside, as Professor Hampton laid out at the beginning, the right to peaceful enjoyment of possessions of others, which is also a qualified right. So the right to respect for private and family life of gypsy travellers and others is also a qualified right, as is the right to property or peaceful enjoyment of possessions of everyone. And the task is really to balance these rights whilst achieving the progressive realisation of the right to adequate housing, which is culturally appropriate. And for some that will be transit sites, permanent sites, and for others it will be settled accommodation. So balancing all of that requires an understanding of the facts. What is, as you pointed to, the situation in terms of the availability of adequate stopping places? Where are they available? Where are they not? What are the barriers that were pointed to? Let's sit around the table together rather than individual evidence sessions or individual and disparate responsibility, but local authorities, national government, gypsy traveller communities and others whose rights are affected around the table to negotiate a solution on the basis of understanding the facts, the analysis of the human rights that are affected and the equality duties as well, identification of who among the actors has what types of responsibilities and what actions they should be taking, and then a process which recalls over time to see whether those steps have been taken. In other words, there's a lot of research, and one of the things that we've certainly heard, and I'm sure the committee also has heard, I've seen it in written evidence from Gypsy travellers and others who work with them, is that there is a volume of research, and the committee has added to that, but what's lacking is action as a result of that. So what we're proposing for the committee's consideration is that it recommends that the government, together with local authorities and others with responsibility, exercise that leadership that Ewan has talked about, that is in Amnesty's submission, that MECOP and others have also pointed to, and develop an action plan to address the gaps that we have at present, and to develop a roadmap for realising the rights of Gypsy traveller communities and of others, settled communities and others as well.
Professor Hampton, do you want to come in on that question?
Yeah, I mean, just to add that we've had, equality legislation, we've had the human rights legislation in place, we've had policies, and we've got lots of research, and it's not through lack of trying. And I think that I personally, when I was in the Commission for Racial Equality, did a lot of work with government at the time to try and address those 37 recommendations. And although there was commitment and leadership in some parts of the country, I think the sustainability is an issue, because we get off to a good start and there isn't that continuity. And with the process that Duncan Wilson has outlined, you do have that collective responsibility. It's not just the government, or it's not just the local authority, but other housing providers as well, the private housing providers as well, will have an opportunity to come together to understand the rights of others, and also to be part of the solution. And I think that's a huge advantage, is when you feel the solution has come from you. And so that kind of interaction is very useful to have. But it'll also kick off a mapping that somebody mentioned earlier, to get a real insight into where really the gaps are, and then to find national solutions for them rather than local. Although the services are delivered locally, I think a national strategy on this would be very useful, so that local authorities and other partners are constantly talking to each other, as are those affected. And the recall for me is the most important part, so that there is a monitoring function, that there is somebody keeping an eye, that it's not heavy investment at the beginning and then nothing towards year 3 and year 4.
Thank you for that. Just before I bring in John Finney with a supplementary on this, can I just ask Mr Page, when I asked my question at the very start of your answer, you spoke about equality outcomes. Who will monitor those equality outcomes? I think a bit of background in that would be quite helpful.
Of course. Before I answer that, Convener, there was an element to your previous question that I didn't really address. You asked the question regarding should there be a duty placed on public authorities around a requirement for minimal compliance around site provision and so forth. Where you require minimum compliance, that's precisely what you tend to get, minimal compliance. The model we would like to encourage is one much more along that advocated by Professor Hampton a moment ago. Communities must feel that they are equal partners in delivering better outcomes, and this should be about taking the structures and processes that are in place to identify desired outcomes, and making sure that Gypsy traveller communities at the regional and local and national level are a valued and legitimate voice in that process. So we should be very circumspect about the idea of minimal compliance. We work in a outcomes-focused policy environment in Scotland. It's about making sure that the voices of some of the most marginalised communities are heard clearly when outcomes are being identified and set, and resources identified to support the progressive realisation of these outcomes. On your question about monitoring, we will, as I said, be commissioning a piece of work to look at the analysis of equality outcomes when we get the first round of these in spring next year. We are well aware of some of the kinds of issues we would expect to see addressed through the equality outcomes process. Now, the Commission has, at the end of the day, enforcement powers where public authorities fail to meet the requirements of the general and specific duties. We can issue legally binding compliance notices and so forth. Again, though, that is very much seen as the last resort. It is once we start going down the route of compliance, we will get again the minimal compliance route. We don't envisage using enforcement powers except where there is clear and overwhelming evidence of recalcitrant authorities simply refusing either to meet the bare minimum required by the duties or to try and put that into practice. Our approach is more about how we, in dialogue with public authorities, help them in that job of mapping out what they are doing through the identifying and setting equality outcomes, and how that is being wove through the wider outcome setting process within local authority areas. We'll also be talking to ministers with regard to their duties under the Equality Act to make sure that's replicated at the national level. So we have a role around monitoring not less evaluating, more monitoring equality outcomes, and we have the ultimate sanction of enforcement and compliance. But our approach is based on trying to foster dialogue and agreed ways of working rather than going down the compliance route except as an option of last resort.
Thank you for that. That was very helpful. I've got John Finney with a supplementary, and then I'll bring in Mark BIAGI.
Thank you, Convener. It's primarily for Mr Page, but I'd be happy to hear from the other panel members too. And I'll try and phrase a question out of the many overlapping elements there are to this issue. I have a concern that, I commend the approach taken by the North East Councils, and I think the joint approach is the way as would be suggested by the Christie Commission. I find it very hard to accept the view that we heard that several years on they've been unable to identify land for transit sites, because I imagine that commercial property developers won't have had such difficulty. So I wonder if you see a role with the joining of the housing needs assessment and local plans for early identification is one aspect. And picking up on, excuse me, on the comment we heard from Mr Wilson about the requirement to facilitate the gypsy way of life, I wonder if a mapping of traditional sites, you consider that would be a helpful exercise, because I can certainly think of one in my area which is in the zone for housing, and again property developers will be seen as potential beneficiaries of that particular zoning. I also wonder if you feel that, given I'm from the Highlands, Highland Council, for instance, has 4 sites, three permanent sites and 1 seasonal site. And if we see the figures, that means there are quite a number of authorities who have no sites. Now, are they meeting their obligations by having no sites? Because I fear that some will think, well, I keep my head down, we don't have a site with no problems. We try and have a site, then as they see it, they may have difficulty. So I know that's very convoluted. I wonder if the panel can maybe pick up on these issues. That is the relationship between the housing need assessment and the local plan, mapping of traditional sites, and whether obligations have been met by those local authorities who have no provision at all for gypsy travellers. Thank you.
That's a series of interlinked and huge questions. On your first, yes, it's often a word that's bandied around, but I think what we're talking about here is mainstreaming that if you are both in housing strategies and in your planning strategies, you're failing to take account of the needs of traveller communities within your area, then you're proceeding on the basis of partial or incomplete evidence. So you inevitably will be producing outcomes less optimal outcomes than you could. So yes, absolutely. A mapping exercise, again, evidence is absolutely key to this. That's going to involve tapping into local knowledge, as you say, but it's also going to mean effective dialogue with the communities affected. Communities who completely understandably are increasingly wary of engagement with public authorities, because where engagement comes, it usually comes in the form of being moved on or evictions and so forth. So there's a big issue of leadership and indeed trust in undertaking that exercise. But I would have thought that regional and local mapping would be extremely valuable where authorities are saying that they're struggling with identifying sites because they don't have any knowledge of the seasonal migratory patterns of communities within their areas. An obvious first step would be to talk to these communities, make sure you have the evidence there. On the question of meeting obligations, Highland Council covers an area the size of Belgium, I believe. It, on the face of it, seems unlikely that 4 sites within that kind of geographical area is going to be adequate. But it goes back to the previous question around gathering evidence and listening to the communities affected so that they are partners in devising solutions. There is no obligation under local housing strategies to provide sites. There's guidance requiring local authorities to consider needs. Again, it's about what is going to be the most effective means of fostering dialogue, communication, effective evidence gathering, and meaningful and holistic outcomes. Is that going to be around statutory obligation, or is it going to be around utilising the frameworks that are there, through human rights frameworks, the approach which the HRC wholeheartedly endorse, that the SHRC have set out, about using the existing regulatory requirements to gather evidence, engage in dialogue with affected communities and setting equality outcomes, and making sure that these equality outcomes are read across to the work of community planning partnerships in setting in devising single outcome agreements. So it's I'm maybe slightly ducking the last question about obligations, but I think we need to be wary about whether we're actually going to get any further forward by introducing another round of statutory or regulatory obligations in councils. And it's more about how we encourage the national, local and regional dialogue and approach with appropriate oversight and review, as my colleagues from SHRC have mentioned, to ensure that public authorities, the settled community and travelling community all realise it's in their own interest to proceed on the basis of dialogue and shared ownership of the kinds of outcomes they want to see.
Yes, Professor Hampton, yes.
If I may pick up on this, I suppose to simplify that and to sort of clarify that, it seems like both EHRC and the Scottish Human Rights Commission are coming at it, wanting to achieve the same outcome, but coming at it in different ways. And I think to build trust, to make informed decisions, to make that decision whether all sites, all local authorities should automatically have sites, can only come from establishing what the facts are. And although we've got all that information on the table, there needs to be people sitting together and discussing it. Because as I said when we started off, one size does not fit all. You might find that the communities themselves might say, well, actually, we don't really require a site or in that particular local authority, but we need more in other local authorities. So it's not a matter of we have 4 here, should we have 4 there, or should we have any more there? If you come at it from a rights perspective, then I think every local authority should be aware that they ought to take into consideration the rights of every citizen that may be passing through their local authority that might have a certain type of accommodation requirement, which means in their planning, consideration should be given to it. And that will be in terms of the evidence they use in order to allocate resources and to plan the available land. I don't see it as a matter so much anymore as equality. I see it as a matter of a right that people have to the type of accommodation that they might have requirements for. And the only way you can understand that, the level of that need, is by getting all the right kind of stakeholders around the table. Because otherwise we will be speculating on the basis of evidence from different parts of the country. And I think that's a dangerous route to take. I think that the situation in Glasgow, for example, is so much more different from the situation in the north and in the Highlands. The type of accommodation requirements are very different, where there are sites required in the Highlands and stop sites as well. Perhaps in the urban area, people are wanting more settled types of accommodation, but perhaps of a different size. And so we need to actually get these interactions across the country with different stakeholders and different local authorities to have to start building that dialogue and to start building the trust, and then to come out with solutions for different areas. When I said we need a national strategy, it didn't mean we can't have local plans emerging from that national strategy.
Yes, Mr. Page.
I'm very happy to reassure Professor Hampton. I don't think there is actually that much difference between the approaches, and I think the HRC would agree this is fundamentally a human rights issue. My point, perhaps not particularly well articulated, was that we do have, public authorities have the regulatory framework, the positive framework of the equality duties to help them think through how they go around exactly that kind of local engagement, so that they are avoiding a one-size-fits-all approach where they are actually encouraged to devise outcomes jointly with the communities affected. So I think we have complementary rather than parallel approaches with our colleagues at the SHRC.
BIAGI and then John Mason for questions.
My question is more to Professor Hampton and Mr. Wilson, because I think Mr. Page has already given his view on this. But to what extent are the perceptions amongst the, for want of a better term, settled community, the obstacle to creating that kind of dialogue that you had described as the ideal outcome?
In some parts of the country, I think it is a real barrier. If you look at, or if you go by the negative reporting in the media, which actually stirs up negative relationships in the community, and some of the issues are grossly exaggerated. Yes, there might be fly tipping and so on. I'm not denying that that could be part of the lifestyle. However, the exaggeration and especially the role of the media in painting this negative picture and exaggerating the problem creates tensions, and it then becomes a standoff between property ownership and not in my backyard, and the impact on house prices, and it's a complex argument, and it gets driven by the majority who happen to be in settled accommodation, and I think that as a minority and as an ethnic group, discrimination then starts undermining any positive discussions that you might have on the issue, and I do think that it is a barrier, and that's why the proposal we have for negotiated outcomes, negotiated solutions, and indeed negotiated monitoring. I think that having dedicated organisations to monitor is not entirely feasible, really, given that we monitor so many things. I think that if you have an interaction and you have collective agreements, you have collective monitoring as well. And so, it means that the people that might be likely to be barriers, like the settled communities, might become part of the solution and start helping to resolve the problem.
If I might just briefly add to that, I think what we're all saying in very similar ways, and I agree with you, and we're complementing one another very well, is that the failure at present of Scotland to proactively grasp this issue and to reconcile the rights of everyone in Scotland, including those who have culturally specific accommodation requirements, is leading to a cycle of occupation, often, evictions, conflict. And what we're proposing is a more proactive approach. But there's no doubt that discrimination underpins that. I think a positive reaction now would be for all of those involved to exercise their right to participate in shaping solutions. And there are genuine and legitimate opinions, views, experiences on all sides of this debate. So I would caution against further increasing that wedge or that distance. But we have reported, as others have, and Amnesty in its research has documented this very clearly, that there are discriminatory attitudes presented in public, in the media, to the extent that in our submission to the United Nations this year, in the Universal Review of all of the UK's human rights obligations, we quoted a researcher who summarised that by saying it is culturally acceptable to be racist to gypsy travellers in Scotland. And that clearly is unacceptable.
That takes me back to something that was in the EHRC submission. There's a claim, I know you didn't write it, but there's a claim that these attitudes are mirrored in blogs which incite hatred. That's a very serious claim.
Well, yes, as I understand, there are issues around message boards, blogs, comments boards on local and national newspaper sites, and we know of at least one occasion where a newspaper site had to remove comments when it became clear that they were responsible for the comments that were being left by subscribers. I think this feeds back to Duncan's point about it being an acceptable or a more acceptable form of discrimination than others in contemporary Scotland. There is obviously the nature of new media and the propensity for people to troll and evince opinions in a way that they would never dream of in another setting. But yes, it is an issue, and it's part of the legitimacy element of the 3 L's that I talked about earlier, and it's part of the challenge that faces local and national media in how it chooses to frame debates.
Given the salience of the issue in current policy debates, do you think the media is effectively self-regulating in this area?
I think we can point to good and bad practice. Undoubtedly, the good relations flashpoints that we're all too familiar with in certain parts of Scotland are fuelled by and exacerbated by slanted and selective media reporting. However, there are other examples we can think of where the media has played a positive role in articulating the articulating the point that was made by Duncan Wilson a moment ago about everybody in all sides of this debate being bearers of rights and responsibilities, and recognising the legitimacy of the whole spectrum of views across this difficult area is a necessary precondition to reaching an agreed conclusion. So there's good and bad out there.
From our side, this is clearly a very sensitive and timely question that you've asked, and I'm not going to express a view on the question of regulation, because our Commission has made it very clear that it wants to consider very carefully its position on that. But what I can say is that it obviously engages two, and others, but two human rights issues, both of which are qualified. The right to freedom of expression, which is qualified, and it's perfectly acceptable to regulate the acceptable speech and the limits of that, as Scotland does, and the right to private and family life, and to be free from the extreme elements of speech which is aggravated by prejudice or hate speech, as it's called. But I'm afraid we wouldn't be in a position to state what our view is on regulation, self-regulation, or otherwise at this point.
Can I just make a point on discrimination? 2 points. One, I'm not disagreeing with my colleague from the EHRC. I'm just saying that we are coming at it to achieve the same end, but with different angles, if you like. Fully support everything that you have said. The second thing on discrimination, I leaving the media aside for a minute, it is the last bastion of respectable racism, if you want to put it that way. I mean, I've been involved in the area of discriminations, particularly race, and the days of no dogs, no gypsies, no blacks, seems like all the other groups have fought their battles in a way slightly more successfully. The Roma, Gypsy and traveller communities have been left behind, and because of the recent negativism in Europe towards the Roma and immigration, it's actually impacting on all kinds of travellers and Gypsies and Roma communities. And I do think that is now one of the more urgent. If you look at the discrimination spectrum from a race perspective, it is that area that is of great concern, because even ethnic minority communities who suffered discrimination themselves probably 10 or 20 years ago tend to have prejudices towards the Gypsy traveller community. And I found that in a piece of personal research that I've done recently.
Supplementary from Siobhan McMahon on that subject.
It was on the media, and Mr Wilson, you touched on it slightly, but I was going to direct my question to Mr Page, if you don't mind, and it might be a bit unfair given you didn't do the submission, and again Amnesty aren't here today to defend their submission. But it was on something that Amnesty had said in their submission. They said that we as people should be careful of the language that we use, not just the media, but how we interpret things. And they said that we shouldn't really talk about illegal traveller sites, because again we talk about the overcrowding problems and not necessarily enough sites around the country, and therefore to talk about temporary sites in that way puts a negative perspective on it. But when we came to the submission from EHRC, you slightly went one further in calling them unlawful encampments. And again, given that Amnesty are saying you shouldn't use the word illegal, and possibly we should use different options like unauthorised to describe temporary sites, I'm just wondering how that relationship between yourselves and Amnesty, because obviously we're trying to look with all submissions, and that seems conflicting.
I'm happy to take that observation back and reflect on it. You're absolutely right. I think it picks up on a wider point about the current way the law is understood and applied leads to situations where acting unlawfully is unavoidable. But you're absolutely right. The language is extremely important. I'm happy to take that point back to colleagues and consider it further. On the wider point of the media, it's perhaps worth flagging that we will be revising our guide to the media, which we first published a few years ago, and sent to all, now is it 7,000 different media outlets in Scotland? It's some extraordinary figure. Just setting out some of the issues around in a non-legalistic and not with a view to this being a preamble to enforcement action or so forth, but simply to try and help illustrate some of the issues around the way that gypsy travellers are and problems around interaction with settled communities, accommodation and so forth. The way that these issues are reported and relayed impact on the desired outcome of resolving the issues. So we're going to be revising that guidance with a view to sending out revised guidance to all media outlets in Scotland in 2013. Again, not taking a regulatory view or getting into wider, very current debates post-Leveson about regulation of the press, but trying to, again, foster dialogue and taking a more the virtue of taking a more measured approach in actually furthering the end of, which I'm sure is the end of all editors of local papers, which is advancing the interests of their readerships and their communities.
Mr Wilson.
I might supplement that in response to Siobhan McMahon's question. I have some sympathy with the view of Amnesty on the language question. And I suppose it's easiest to illustrate that if we see the opposite, the failure to adequately provide stopping places as itself unlawful. Certainly in terms of international human rights obligations, the current state of delivery of culturally appropriate accommodation is a stain, if you like, on Scotland's human rights reputation. We in the UK more generally have been criticised in the Universal Periodic Review of the United Nations by the Council of Europe Advisory Committee on the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, and the European Committee on Social Rights. And I may be missing some there for this failure as yet to do what we're all proposing today, to reconcile the rights of everyone. So labelling a community's action in seeking accommodation options when none others are available as itself illegal invokes a criminal justice response which really ought to be the last resort. There are legitimate circumstances in which those with private property rights can seek from the state the enforcement of their right to enjoy peaceful enjoyment of their possessions. But really that's when the state has failed, if you like. And those should be the isolated incidents of illegal activity rather than the regular response of the state, which has itself failed to provide adequate accommodation.
Another supplementary.
Yes, my final question. The journalistic code emphasises the importance of a right to reply, but Amnesty's research found that only 6% of the articles about gypsy travellers presented a community voice. Do you think that's... how much do you think that's down to an inability to participate in media structures through having the requisite spokespersons and organisations, and how much do you think that is a sidelining?
I think it's related to the leadership question and building capacity within the communities, part of the issue. But I think inevitably it is also about, particularly in local media, about reflecting the views of those who are shouting loudest at any given time, rather than actively seeking the views of the other side of the story.
Well, I can't comment on the research done by Amnesty, or speculate on the cause of that. But, what comes to mind could be capacity issue, but also what comes to mind is that, whoever has actually articulated the story best gets reflected in the media, and it's difficult to say from that percentage to make any assumptions. I wouldn't, because I wasn't involved in that.
I know I said that was my final question, but I suppose what I was asking was if a journalist wanted to go to a Gypsy Traveller community and find a comment from them, is that something they could reasonably do?
Well, I think the first thing I would say instinctively to that is trust. I think if you have been maligned, negatively in the media, you wouldn't want to go and participate in any article that is going to be published, because there isn't trust there. And if you want to have that engagement, as I said, you would need to actually start building relationships with the community to get an inroad. Now, when you started off by asking us if we visited sites, I think even just popping in as observers, it can be quite offensive, because you've coming to watch and you're not going to take any action necessarily. And I think those that have actually engaged with the communities for a long time find it easier to do site visits to really establish what the issues are and the problems are. And any interaction that happens between the Gypsy Traveller communities and individuals and the press would only happen, I think, on the basis of trust. Because if you feel you've been always negatively represented, you would not want to, naturally, and this is based on my experience of those suffering racism, they refuse to give their side of the story, often because of the way in which, for example, the time when the Daily Mail ran the campaign on immigrants, those of immigrant communities just refused to give their side of the story because they felt it wouldn't be fairly reflected.
Okay. John Mason?
Thanks, Adina. Yeah, following on, we've covered quite a lot of ground, but I mean, continuing just a little bit on the media theme, I mean, I take the point that you don't want to talk about regulation of the media, at least at this stage. But there's certainly, I mean, I thought, Mr. Page, you were quite generous to the media that you said there were some good stories and some bad stories, because looking at the amnesty information, it's hugely on the negative side. There are obviously issues around the regulating the media, but I suppose there's a wider issue of community attitude and education and things. I mean, we haven't really mentioned schools so far, and that tends to be the answer. If we want to change something, we go to the schools, and I accept they can't do everything. But I mean, would that be a route you would support, that we should be doing more in the schools in this regard, to kind of, if we're trying to change attitudes of the public, of journalists, of everybody?
Yeah. I mean, again, we did no particular piece of research on this from the Scottish Human Rights Commission perspective, but awareness raising and education is always the route to informing people about prejudices. I mean, this was the strategy we pushed. And as I was coming in, I was handed a leaflet by STEP, who do a lot of work on engaging Scotland's community in education. But that can be broadened out to not just trying to include the Gypsy Traveller community into education, encouraging them to access education or enabling them to access education, but to actually, part of the mainstreaming agenda is to integrate in the curriculum teachings on discrimination, whether it be towards ethnic minority communities or the Gypsy Traveller. And I think that would be indeed a very good place to start in schools, but also I think community education programs.
It's also linked, if I might add, to again obligations and international standards. So the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, under that convention, the UK and of course Scotland as part, ought to be integrating within the curriculum positive images of minorities, and not simply in terms of cultural traditions and so forth, but actually the images of history makers, if you like, or those that are presented in other materials and in different diverse parts of the curriculum. Often you will find, and I know this from previous experience, that, for example, representations of women in textbooks would be as homemakers and men as history makers, and that where there are discrete materials in one part of the curriculum which focus for a day or for a short part of a day on. Today we're looking at the Gypsy Traveller experience, and then the rest of the time that's completely absent. That seems like tokenism in a way, whereas a more integrated approach to looking at the positive images that we have across the curriculum, whether it's in geography or history or different subjects within the curriculum, and ensuring that those reflect the breadth of Scottish society would be a very positive step forward.
And can I just add to that? When I was quite involved in this area a couple of years back, it is an incredible fact that most people forget that some of the traveller communities here are indigenous to Scotland. And I used to get the argument that you are representing newly settled minority ethnic communities and fighting their cause, whereas we are indigenous to this country, some of whom speak Gaelic and yet are excluded. And I think that is something very relevant to consider when we talk about the history of Scotland. It's not as though all of them have come from the outside, as it were, and seen as outsiders. A number of people I spoke to were indigenous to Scottish culture in Scotland. And I think that's a very important factor to use in education.
So much. Just to go back and press you in another area, which was who kind of is responsible for what at a national and local level, because reading the papers, and I accept Amnesty aren't here, it seemed a little bit more hard line, whereas what I'm picking up from you this morning is a bit more like, I think Mr Wilson, you said negotiate a solution at one stage, which I suppose I'm a bit more comfortable with, but I just wanted to really clarify that, because EHRC, in your evidence, however, believe that the operation of the Concordat between central and local government is a barrier to this, as it prevents the government's intervention at a regional level to require action, not just encourage it. I mean, that's quite strong, I feel, and Amnesty also said political leadership to drive this forward, i.e. Scottish Government needs to tell local authorities to get their act together. I don't expect you to defend that particularly, but can you just clarify how you think that this relationship works, and really what now should the government or the Parliament be doing?
I suppose the point could be re-articulated as recognising that the concordat between local and national government undoubtedly has changed the relationship between and the respective decision-making roles. That needs to be accepted and recognised and not used as a justification for joined-up action. We've talked extensively this morning about the need to make sure that effective solutions are not hampered by people carrying jurisdictional boundaries in their heads when they're trying to address what are regional policy challenges and national policy challenges. We need to make sure that the Concordat is not inadvertently encouraging an approach where ministers feel powerless or having very little room for manoeuvre in how they can direct or foster cooperation at the regional or local level.
Specifically, would you have the government, say, a government minister, call a representative from every local authority, sit them all down in a room with some representatives from the Gypsy Traveller community, and they all talk about it? Would that be how you should go forward?
I think I'd endorse the approach that my colleagues from the SHRC have recommended in their submission, that we have an action plan based on human rights that has all the interested parties, where and is based around evidence gathering, robust facts, analysis, identification of how to resolve the issue, and crucially a review and recall mechanism built in. How that is done precisely can be identified down the line, but there is undoubtedly a need to address this problem at the local, regional and national levels.
I would endorse that. I think the first point is that there are various ways in which a country can organise its affairs internally, and the existence or otherwise of single outcome agreements in the Concordat is not in itself a barrier, should not in itself be a barrier to delivering human rights. The obligation rests with Scottish ministers to ensure that the delivery of human rights is consistent across the country. And in an area such as this, where there's a recognised gap, there are recognised inconsistencies, and there's a recognised need for national leadership, then I think, in answer to your second question, that what you have outlined could be one way of achieving that. Certainly that accords with the interaction model that we were proposing earlier, where Scottish ministers exercise leadership in gathering together all of those who share responsibilities to ensure that the rights of gypsy travellers and others are recognised, together with the communities directly affected. I might add that in another area, the Scottish Association for Mental Health, for example, and we have documented this in our research, has analysed the single outcome agreements and recommended that they ought more routinely to integrate human rights and equality considerations within them, and I think that is another vehicle or mechanism that could be explored.
I mean, the other area we haven't touched on liaison officers, I don't think so far. Sorry, yes.
On to that, yep. Can I bring in John Finney and then Dennis Robertson and have supplementaries on that point, John?
Okay, thank you, Convener. I don't know that it automatically follows on from something John said. It was, but if I may, it's a question to Mr. Wilson about the legal aspect. It's just that the term that you've used repeatedly, Mr. Wilson, if I've noted it correctly, culturally appropriate accommodation. Would it be your view or the Commission's view that that would include transit sites and seasonal provision as well?
Yes. And that is not only our view, that is the view of the international and regional human rights bodies, that culturally appropriate means appropriate to the members of minorities themselves. So it's really for them to help shape what they see as appropriate accommodation that meets their requirements. But the answer is yes.
Thank you. It's helpful to have that on the record. Thank you.
Dennis.
Thank you, Convener. It's to go back to it's a brief supplementary on bringing everyone together. Certainly commendable, but I think one of the very loud messages we got from the gypsy travelling people was that they'd actually been failed, and there wasn't really an element of trust. And I think in coming here, I think there was a degree of reluctance to some extent because they were saying that they've been here before, and Parliament has been looking at this issue since 2001. And really, although you're saying bring everyone together, do you actually believe that the gypsy travelling community would have the trust and the faith in actually attending such a meeting?
Certainly, since that's something that I've repeatedly said, I might start that I think one of the distinctions between what we are proposing and what previous experience might be is that element of sustainability that Professor Hampton mentioned before, that recall or follow-up, so that the process itself leads to action and not only recommendations. So the framework, or rather the interaction approach, which we outline on page 9 and 10 of our written submission, the 4 steps, the FAIR framework, includes recall as the final step to ensure accountability. And in that step, all of those who've shaped the action plan in the first round would be reconvene to review whether the steps that were agreed had been taken, if not, why they had not been taken, to understand any barriers to progress and to address them. So the mechanism in itself ensures sustainability or coordination or follow-up and accountability, crucially. And I think one of the things that we recorded from our interactions with gypsy travellers was the very positive response to the 2001 inquiry that this committee undertook, but then the disappointment, which I'm sure you have heard repeatedly, at the lack of follow-up on the 37 recommendations and the lack of implementation of them. So the mechanism that we're proposing seeks to address that by ensuring that it is a process and not a meeting.
Okay, no, that's very kind.
I'll come back to John Mason now for your other questions.
Right, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was an area, and again, I think it was one that maybe Amnesty highlighted more, was the kind of variation in the local authorities as to whether they would have a Gypsy Traveller liaison officer or somebody, a site manager, or some kind of combination of the two. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that, because it's reflecting back to the trust question, which has been mentioned there, of building up relationships rather than just impersonal systems.
As I said, can't comment on the paper written by someone else, but just based on our experience, having somebody dedicated and responsible to champion and do the linking is a good idea, but we would like to see a much more mainstreamed approach where the authority doesn't send, because that can easily become a token somebody that is sent to do it, and nobody else is going to engage with the agenda. And, you know, so I think you need to weigh the pros and cons of it. There could be positives to that, but if it's not implemented consistently and monitored and effectively, and it has outcomes and accountabilities attached to it, it can easily become one person's responsibility and not the council's responsibility. So I would have a few reservations on that.
Okay.
I completely agree with that. It can be very useful, but it shouldn't be seen as a substitute for how local authorities, for example, are strategically addressing with their partners when it comes setting agenda, housing strategies, planning strategies, and so forth. These are decisions that are taken many grades above a liaison officer. It can be very useful, but it's not a substitute.
And I would just take us back to Ewan's very helpful 3 Ls, and I certainly feel that I would lack legitimacy in answering your question directly. That the most important actor to shape the way in which we ensure delivery in practice ought to be the people whose rights are affected. So it should be Gypsy Traveller communities themselves exercising their human right to participate in decisions that affect them, who would outline the best way of ensuring that it happens in practice.
Well, just to follow up on that point, because in a sense that's almost a slightly different way of looking at it, in that because the impression I get, and I'm fairly new on this committee, is that actually this relationships and the trust is extremely important to the Gypsy Traveller community, maybe more than theoretical rights that are written down in theoretical systems. So the combination of the two, is that what we're saying?
Yeah, I think that the rights, obviously I would defend the human rights framework as a legally enforceable basis which sets out the minimum standards that people can expect from the state, and then allows them to shape. And part of that is this right to participate in decisions, which I think we could go further to realising, certainly for Gypsy Travellers, which requires that information that's in accessible forms, a mechanism within which people can shape decisions at a stage that's early enough, where before decisions have actually been taken. So it's quite different from consultation. It's actually shaping the processes before at a stage where it's still open to being developed. And I mean, I think that is really key. That the rights framework is a backstop protection, if you like, and we are one element of ensuring accountability that the state delivers on those human rights. But the crucial actor in deciding how there are many ways of delivering those rights. The crucial actor in deciding how that should best be delivered would be the people who are directly affected.
Okay, thank you.
Just before I bring in Siobhan McMahon, can I just follow on from John Mason's question about Gypsy Traveller liaison officers and site managers? And it was one of the recommendations from the 2001 inquiry that local authorities appoint liaison officers as a separate role from a site manager. Some have done that. There is a mixture across the country. Some have liaison officers, some have site managers. But when we were out doing our visits to gypsy travelling sites, we did hear evidence from gypsy travellers that the site managers are either very rarely on site, they're not very cooperative, they don't actually champion the rights of the gypsy traveller. So would you see it beneficial for the role of gypsy traveller liaison officer to be expanded to act more as a kind of a go-between between the local authority, the gypsy traveller, and the local community to help to build those bridges, and for every local authority to have a liaison officer and a site manager to actually champion the cause?
I just want to reinforce the idea that why go through a third person when the two parties can directly communicate if they're empowered to do so. And that issue of trust needs to, you have to start building that trust with the broader community rather than one individual representing views. Very often that then becomes like a gatekeeper situation as well, because the views get filtered and you know, some issues might not be translated, we're lost in translation if you like. And I'm always nervous about having the middleman. And real empowerment is allowing a dialogue between people that are affected and people that are going to be providing the services or the accommodation. And so I would rather see a direct conversation happening. And you could have a facilitator that is objective and you know, that brings together this dialogue. But, you know, I really do. I'm not very comfortable with expanding the role or with even having the role, actually.
Okay. I'd agree with that. There are potential dangers in being too prescriptive, where a liaison officer with some kind of enhanced advocacy role could play a difference, and there are clear, objective reasons and evidence to back that up, then by all means. But to reiterate my earlier point, an officer should not be a substitute for proper mainstreaming of the needs of gypsy traveller communities in the strategic approach of public authorities, and as my colleagues have indicated, the eco-involvement as equal partners in by these communities themselves in determining outcomes and how they're arrived at.
Okay. Mr Wilson, did you have a comment on it? No. Marco Biaggi. Dennis, did you still want to come in a supplementary?
Just that, on that point, on the liaison officers, actually. Can we do that now?
Yes, you can do
it. The one thing that strikes me is there's a reluctance maybe to have a middleman, but sometimes there's a requirement for someone to articulate views. What we did hear from some of the gypsy travellers and their evidence is they weren't sometimes comfortable. It may be putting things down in paper, there's maybe forms, so I mean there is a role, I think, even as an advocate or a liaison officer or someone to enable a process sometimes. The empowerment's there, but sometimes to enable that and to articulate the view of the community or the individual, you sometimes need that other person.
Experience shows from other areas certainly that at times there is a role for supporting participation, and I think what would also be a mistake is to see that as if you like, a negative obligation, that if people turn up at a local authority and express their views, then they might be heard. But if this is a genuine attempt to reach out and, as people have said, bridge that gap between local authorities and marginalised communities, then there may be value in it. But I think what we're all saying in different ways is that the important person or actor to shape that decision is not really us. The best mechanism to ensure that gypsy travellers' voices are effectively heard and that they can actually exercise their right to participate, it should be gypsy travellers that shape what mechanism should be used, not us.
Can I just say that having a spokesman is different from having a liaison officer. If the communities themselves choose to have people represent their views, then I'm slightly more comfortable with that, rather than the local authority appointing a liaison officer. And I think there is a slight dynamic difference with the power relationship there.
Just a very quick observation. There was an episode maybe 2 years back in Highland Council where council officers who were working on gypsy travel issues expressed concern about the level and nature of the political influence being brought to bear on them by elected members who had their own concerns and their own priorities around representing the views of some of their ward constituents. Again, if there is an absence of a wider political consensus and leadership, having an officer, a named person or officers, however well qualified, their effectiveness can be minimised unless these wider questions of leadership and consensus are addressed.
John Finney and then Michael BIAGI.
That was a very high-profile issue, and indeed was one in relation to which, when you talk about the blogs with papers where the comments there were reprehensible, I would just like to say that the elected member involvement was across the parties, including my own. I would not support the position the elected representatives took. I thought the employee acted, the employee with direct responsibility for the Gypsy Traveller discharged her obligations absolutely appropriately and enjoys my full support.
I'd like to endorse Mr Finney's point, absolutely.
Michael BIAGI and then Siobhan McMahon.
My point was largely asked, but am I right in characterising your view as being that it's more important perhaps for resources to come to advocacy from within the community than liaison officers in-house in local authorities? And if I'm not correct, what is your view with regard to that resource? Because clearly there are resource implications for having GTLOs or indeed not.
I would personally prefer that resource being made available to enable direct conversations between the community and those responsible for providing accommodation. But if you want to start with developing links and building relationships, then I think that needs to come from the communities themselves rather than being elected and being part of the local authority.
Siobhan McMahon then.
Another recommendation of the 2001 inquiry, which was for national a model of tenancy agreement, which has never seen the light of day, given that the group that were established tasked with that are no longer in existence. So I was just wondering, is there still a need in your view for a national model, or should we be looking at something else? Because given that you'll make recommendations as well, I want them to be as useful as possible when we come to make our final report.
I don't think we have any particular view on that specific question, but I reiterate the point that security of tenure is an immediate obligation to ensure that people are not at risk of evictions, summary evictions, or without adequate alternatives.
This is an area, unfortunately, that would benefit from the expertise and insight of my colleague Chris Oswald. I'd be happy to get back to the committee in writing on what's quite a complex area with some number of changes in the law around tenancy. But we'll get back to you in writing, and if you'd like to invite us in for further discussion down the line, we'd be delighted to do that.
Do any of the committee have any further questions for the witnesses? Well, in that case, can I thank the witnesses for coming along this morning? I think it's been a very useful session. So can I thank you not only for the oral evidence that you gave this morning, but also for your written submissions, which will help us in our questioning of future witnesses. So thank you again. And I'll now briefly suspend the meeting. Item 2 is on inquiry witness expenses, and in line with usual practices, members are invited to delegate to me as convener responsibility for arranging for the SPCB to pay under Rule 12.4.3 any expenses of witnesses in its inquiry into where Gypsy Travellers live. Are we all agreed? Thank you very much for that. That is now agreed. And that concludes our meeting today, and our next meeting will be next Thursday morning at 9 AM. Thank you for that.